Order and welcome to the second inquiry session for the Pathways to Work inquiry. And it's a pleasure to welcome our first panel for this session. A very good warm welcome to James Taylor, to Jonathan Andrew and Mikey Erhardt. Would you like to introduce yourselves and the organisations that you represent?
Good morning, I'm James Taylor. I'm Executive Director of Strategy at the disability charity Scope.
Good morning everyone, I'm John Andrew, I'm the Head of Public Affairs at the mental illness charity Rethink Mental Illness and our sister charity Mental Health UK.
Good morning everyone, I'm Mikey Erhardt, I'm a campaigner at the disabled people's organisation Disability Rights UK.
We've all got some questions for you, if that's okay, and I'm going to kick off if that's all right. My first question is in relation to sick and disabled people's current experience of the incapacity and disability benefits system. What would you say that is, both positive and negative? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to kick off. I think.
Go for it, James.
Look, overall, I think the current benefit system is not fit for purpose. I think we've seen that time and time again, and know from many disabled people that there is a real lack of trust, a real lack of engagement from Department of Work and Pensions and Job Centre in terms of supporting individuals. Many disabled people who speak to us at Scope tell us that the system's focused on monitoring compliance rather than supporting them. It's focused on trying to understand what people can't do rather than what they can do. We hear from many people that the Job Centre really is impersonal and ineffective. And on top of this, the level of benefit is nowhere near enough for the people who need to make use of welfare payments to be able to survive. I think the overwhelming experience of most people is one of negativity rather than one of positivity. Of course, there are good cases where people receive a good outcome, but overwhelmingly, many people we speak to feel like they're written off and feel like they're being punished simply because of their disability.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what James has said. I'd just add, from kind of a mental illness perspective, first of all, we do accept that an assessment to establish your extent of illness and capability for work is unlikely to ever be a particularly comfortable or pleasant experience. So even in kind of a utopian world where the government was doing everything right, there would still be challenges there, and we recognise that. But I still think there's a lot more that could be done to be making it a lot better than it is, and making it a lot more trauma-informed, particularly with mental illness. I mean, the system, the DIP, are always keen to state that you will be assessed by a health professional, and that is true, but there's no guarantee that the health professional has the relevant expertise which matches to your situation. So kind of an example of that would be somebody could be getting an assessment because of complications to do with their schizophrenia and psychosis and be assessed by a physiotherapist. And so we think that there's some low-hanging fruit there that really isn't quite good enough, and what this can lead to is situations of really, really worryingly bad practice. We hear things about somebody explaining to the assessor they've had suicidal ideation and then being asked, okay, well, if you've had suicidal ideation for so long, why are you still here? People self-harming in the session and smacking their head against the desk and being told not to make a scene. People having to explain that their eating disorder does not mean they can't physically eat, so they shouldn't get loads of questions about can you raise your arm to your mouth. It is not an easy job being one of these assessors. They need more help, but these aren't just a couple of bad cases. We hear this a lot, and I think there's a lot that can be done there to make it more trauma-informed from a mental illness point of view.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Mikey?
Nothing that has already been said is stuff that we disagree with. I think from our perspective, it's the process itself makes people sicker, right? We did research with Durham University looking at specific elements of how the assessment process, particularly for PIP, works, and of the respondents we had, it was around 84% said the assessment process has damaged my mental health. And that is removing all the other aspects of your life as a disabled person that might make your mental and physical health worse. Just the pure assessment process. Applying for benefits, not getting the right level, getting the right kind of support, just physically applying, made my mental health worse. And the instances that Jonathan's just given are not surprising. That is the experience that lots of people have. the pressure, I think, for lots of disabled people, it feels like you are justifying, in some ways, being in the room, even applying in the first place. Your relationship with an assessor is not working out what your need is. It is justifying that you are applying for benefits in the first place, that you deserve to even be there. I think all of this is probably going to get worse when the pressure now is to reach an arbitrary fiscal figure on how many people don't get support anymore. That is going to get worse, and from our perspective, you can't undervalue how dangerous that is, right? The tangible effect of changes that are being proposed are pretty obvious, right? And you'd be naive to think that there is a level that you can already cut from the system that would be, I don't know, in some ways palatable or manageable. There's not. So these cuts are going to lead to deaths, most likely, right? It was the National Audit Office, 2020, at least 69 deaths by suicide as a result just of problems with benefit claims. And within that report, they spoke about it's probably quite a lot higher because of how the DWP failed to measure, and lots of other reasons why that already existing level of purely caused by the benefit system deaths is higher. It's quite likely that the way we're going, the trajectory is that will get worse. The assessments will get harder. The stress will be higher. And yeah, there is no way of sugarcoating that.
And I noticed that Ellen Clifford has just joined us. A very warm welcome, Ellen. Lovely to see you today. So my first question to the panel, and if you feel up to it, if you're able to respond, was in terms of how the current system is for sick and disabled people, both positive and negative.
Thanks, Debbie. I agree with everything Mikey's just said. The assessment system really does negatively impact on mental health of people going through it. It moves people further from employability because every time you have a reassessment, there's the fear of financial insecurity, and then there is I would use the word trauma that's involved with repeatedly going through your history and focusing on the things that you can't do, and also feeling that you are having to justify yourself to someone who may not be trusting you and may have negative views of you. I think when you get the assessment reports back and it doesn't accurately portray what you've said to them, it causes a distrust in the system. I've had people describe it to me as feeling violated because they've shared such very, very personal information and been through this very difficult experience to then have that not properly represented can be very harmful for people. The other big issue that people talk to me about, one young woman with learning difficulties, Emma Rowland, who gave testimony to the United Nations on this, was the experience of people who are in the limited capability for work group, but who just don't have a realistic prospect of paid employment and have this continual experience of applying for jobs and being rejected, of doing work placements continuously, never leading to a job. And we know that there is huge amounts of discrimination against people with learning difficulties within the workplace. There are also productivity questions, there are productivity questions that get asked by employers. I know there's the issue that comes up repeatedly about whether people with learning difficulties should be exempted from the minimum wage. And she is a young woman, as many people I speak to, who desperately wants a job, who wants to be able to have that status you have in society, and also particularly since the RAG cut in April 2017, it's a very low amount of money for people to be expected to live on. But there's this additional component of the continual rejections then creating trauma and creating mental health difficulties for people. So I think overall that one of the big problems with the system is that it isn't trauma informed, and it's actually reinforcing people's trauma and creating new mental distress for people. I think what works is that where people do get found eligible, it keeps disabled people in relative poverty as opposed to destitution. And if that's the best we can have in our lives, then we'd much rather have that than the destitution. And the big fear, of course, with the Green Paper proposals is that that safety net is going to be taken away from huge numbers of people on a scale that it's really quite difficult to fathom how it could be considered a good thing to do for society. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, on that I'll carry on, if I may, with you, Ellen, and we'll go down the panel in the reverse order. So thinking about that, the point that you've made about it really only covering people from relative poverty. What do you think in terms of those that say that the current system disincentivises people into work?
I find that quite curious, and I'm not aware of any evidence base for those claims. I am quite bemused sometimes by conversations about trying to get people into work that don't seem to take into account the very real barriers that people face. It is quite often, for where we're talking about people who have limited capacity for work and work-related activity, quite often we're not talking about a skills deficit or a lack of education. It is the fact that many people in that group, we have many days, many hours every day where we're simply unable to function due to extreme levels of pain, whether that's emotional or physical, due to the significance of physical impairment. So, for example, people with neurodegenerative conditions with high levels of support need, it can take a few hours every day to get up and dressed, and then there's the requirement of continual medical appointments, therapeutic appointments, having to travel to those. That doesn't actually leave a realistic amount of time in the day, and certainly not the energy within the day then to be able to take on paid work. Many people I know in the LCWRA do, however, still contribute to society in really important ways. But it has to be extremely flexible. It has to be around those periods of time when we are actually able to function. And it's very difficult to find paid work where you have that extreme flexibility. I know that some research has been done by Ben Geiger and Catherine Hale looking at that and how Flex Plus jobs have only really benefited people with childcare so far, and those kind of jobs are quite rare. So, for example, I know one with a neurodegenerative condition, she's unable to breathe on her own anymore, unable to clear her lungs. Her life is spent in and around various medical appointments, and she's a trained counsellor, and she actually counsels to people for free, but on the basis that there is that extreme flexibility of appointments being counselled at any minute. And she does training. She's involved with her local council as a governor, I believe, for a local school as well. Many people do contribute in ways that don't fit within the paid workplace environment. I don't think that like I said, I don't think there's an evidence base for this, and it's certainly nothing that I've ever witnessed.
Thank you. Mikey, do you want to add to that?
Of course. And I just want to echo everything that Ellen has said, and I think from our perspective, we wouldn't want anyone ever to think that their worth is dictated by whether or not they've got full-time paid employment, and that feels like the cut through from the Green Paper proposals is that you are eligible and deserving of support if you are working. If not, you are in some ways a different class of citizen, and that is incredibly distressing, and it's an experience that loads of disabled people I speak to all the time already experience, and we're just opening that up for more and more people. The problem with the world of work and getting people into work is the world of work. It's nothing to do in some ways with the benefit system. It is that workplaces are hostile to disabled people and our needs, that they are pressurised, competitive, in a lot of cases in some ways dangerous and destabilising environments. And when you think about the kind of precarious work that is growing more and more in this country, low paid, 0 hours contracts, that is quite often physically and mentally very intensive. Those are the sort of jobs that in lots of places are the only work available. That pushing people into those jobs, into the risk of those jobs, it's not going to achieve much, right? And all it really does is put people in a dangerous and worrying position. Your health's going to get worse even if you do pick up work. I think an example that's useful to think about as well is there's no quick fix for this. Like, the way to think about it is not just putting a bit more onus on employers, doing something like the Mayfield review and then saying, oh, look, employers just need to be a little bit better. It is going to be very difficult to drastically improve the world of work for disabled people quickly and at the pace you'd need to even mitigate in little forms the green paper cuts. I was looking at some Unison research around reasonable adjustments, which is, one of the few tools disabled people have to make their workplace better for themselves. It's around 74% of disabled workers reported being refused some or all of their adjustments. And then when we go back to thinking about the kind of workplaces that are opening up, the kind of work, precarious work, those are also often the least union recognised workplaces, the ones with the, essentially, least flexibility for people. So yeah, overall, when we're thinking about the world of work, it's beyond this committee. It's not the benefit system, it's work.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikey. Jonathan.
Thank you. I'll keep it quick. I know we've got a lot to get through. What I would just say to add to what we've heard is I can see why when we talk about economic inactivity in general, it's often couched in terms of incentives. I think when it comes to incapacity benefits, at the point of entering in the system, it's not really about incentives, it's really about capacity. Because the whole premise of the capacity benefits is that you haven't got a straightforward choice between do I work or do I not work. There are times further in the system where this does become a bit more relevant, like for people who have been on LCWRA for a long time, who might feel they're slightly improving and might feel like they want to try certain types of work. We do hear a lot that people are scared to put their head above the parapet in any way or engage in any way because that might lead to them being reassessed. So the kind of right to try principle in the Green Paper we think is the right one, and we do whatever we can to help communicate it. There's a real lack of trust though, and I think it's going to be quite hard to communicate to people and ensure that people know they have that right. But I think I think that is a move in the right direction.
Thank you. James.
I think to echo what other panellists have said, this is beyond the welfare system. It's actually more of a workplace issue, an employer issue. If the jobs don't exist, or as Mikey's been saying here, it's unsuitable, unstable work, you might succeed in moving some people off benefits and into those jobs, but very quickly probably back onto benefits again. So it does very little to solve the problems the government's intending to set out. The only other thing I'd say is that, for a lot of people, work is not an option or an outcome, as Ellen's talked about, and I think we need to ensure that government understands that and those individuals feel supported. The only other thing I'd say is there are people who go through very stressful assessments, receive some financial security from the welfare system and do not want to jeopardise that at all because they're worried about sanctions or conditionality or whatever else that exists in the system, and therefore sort of hunker down and try to exist off the benefits they're being provided with.
Thank you, James. Joanna Baxter.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. How effective do you think the personal independence payment is in helping people with the additional costs associated with their disability or their health condition? Don't know who wants to go first.
I'm happy to start again. Overall, it has limited effectiveness. Our research at Scope, the disability price tag, looks at the extra cost of disability. We calculate that at £1,010 on average that a disabled household in the UK would need to have the same standard of living as a non-disabled household. That is far higher than the highest rate of PIP that's available to those households. So from looking at those two things, we would say PIP does not go far enough in dealing with the extra cost that many disabled people face. Now, it's a broad spectrum. There are some disabled people who have very few extra costs, and PIP might work for those. But when you look at it on a national level and for the whole population, it's clear that the extra costs of disability are far higher than the financial support that's available for individuals to meet those costs. And those costs have been going up with inflation. We've seen things like energy price rises and other bills going up, and PIP has not kept up with those.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of that, and just say it is not usually sufficient for people, but it is still really important. And we've done some work since the Green Paper came out, looking at what people with mental illness are spending PIP on in order to ascertain what's going to happen when they lose it. And we've found so far that 1 in 2 are using PIP to access private medical treatment because they're on waiting lists and can't get help with the NHS. And you're currently 8 times more likely to have to wait 1.5 years for treatment if your condition is mental rather than if it's physical. And so in a way that kind of suggests that PIP is filling gaps elsewhere in the system. And we find that kind of really concerning. There's been a government drive on getting down waiting times, but specifically for elective waits, as they call them, which is physical. So we can't quite see why there's not more being done to really tackle what we see as being more the root of the problem, rather than trying to trim off things from PIP.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's the same experience for us. I think the important thing for the committee to remember as well is that PIP is a passport for other forms of support. I think Carers Alliance has been mentioned quite a lot, and there are roughly like 150,000 carers or something like that who will lose that allowance if they also lose PIP through the tightening of the assessment criteria. And PIP is an important gateway for a lot of people to accessing, and in some ways validating their experiences and accessing further support. It's a worrying trajectory to be thinking about how can we make that harder for people. An assessment that's similar to the WCA, which we assume we'll get onto in a bit, is dehumanising, frustrating, scary, fundamentally, and then to think we're going to make that harder is just, there's not a lot more to say on it.
Ellen?
Yeah, so I'd echo everything that's been said. Increasingly, people are having to use PIP for essentials because of the increase in cost of living. So we're not able to then be able to use the PIP for those extra disability costs. However, where we can, where there is that possibility, it's making up for not just the waiting times in the NHS, but as has been mentioned, also private therapy. So for people with mental health, the mental health system less and less is able to provide services that really tackle complex trauma. A lot of the interventions are short term and therefore limited in their effectiveness. It's very much a case of see the psychiatrist, get stabilised on your medication, get discharged. There are lots of people in the mental health system living with enduring and severe mental distress who don't regularly see any form of mental health professional unless we use our PIP for private therapy. Also with social care situation, there are many people who need but don't receive any form of ongoing social care support. So PIP does allow you to, whether it's paying for people to assist you with domestic tasks and personal care, or whether it's just being able to pay for travel for family and friends to come and provide support to you, because that's lacking. So yeah, it doesn't go far enough.
So just to follow up on that, can I ask what would be your response to the argument that we've read reports in the press that somehow too many people are claiming PIP on mental health grounds? What would be your response to that?
I think that's probably one I should go first on. Yeah. I think it's a complicated issue, the rising mental health need, and I can see intuitively why some people look at rising need of mental health and come to the conclusion that this must be being driven by some sort of semantic thing. We must be changing the goalposts for what counts as mental health, especially when we obviously hear about it a lot more than we used to hear about it. So I get that, but I think if you interrogate the evidence, that it's actually clear that doesn't tell anywhere near the full story. There's talk about self-diagnosis a lot, but when there's statistics that are relevant to DWP or health, these are all medical, so we can kind of park that for a second. So the medical diagnoses of various mental illnesses are going up. Now, of course, you could do the Nigel Farage argument and say that that's because doctors are getting it wrong. It's quite a big claim to make about medical professionals, but it's possible. But if you then interrogate it further and you say, okay, actually, the number of people appearing in hospitals with severe self-harm has also gone up, especially among young people, especially among young girls. And the suicide rate is now at its highest point than it's been at any time in the 21st century. And they're not miscounting the bodies, sorry to put a fine point on it. So I think we have to get real about the fact that, yes, there's rising awareness, but there also is a rising crisis. And that's not me saying that rising awareness has no impact on finding more cases, but it's a bit like if you look back to 2020 with COVID, where we introduced mass testing. Of course, that found more COVID cases. That didn't mean that we were misdiagnosing anyone. It just meant that we were locating more of the cases, and that's a good thing. So to use the COVID metaphor, what we're kind of seeing now is a mixture of looking at mental illness more and finding more of the real cases, which were always there, but we're now identifying, while there's also, however you want to say it, a new variant or a spike of something happening. So there's a couple of trends happening at the same time. And that's not easy for society, it's a challenge, but it's the right thing to do that we've looked under the kind of rock labelled mental health and tried to address this. And it is going to mean some alarm when we see how bad the problem is, but that doesn't mean the problem's not there and we can't wish it away.
Yeah. No.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to come back to the issue that you were talking around the funding and what PIP was used on. And you said about the 1 in 2 people with mental health diagnoses quite often are using it for private medical expenses. And I'm guesting this morning from the Health and Social Care Select Committee. So I'm just interested in your take on where you think mental health services could and should improve to start addressing this problem. You've talked about the other end, where we're getting people back into work, rightly so, fantastic, all the things need to happen. But in terms of the mental health system, I just wondered if you could talk about how the funding you think might be there to help within a 10-year strategy that's coming forward.
Yeah, I think what I'd say about mental health strategy on a policy point of view, first off, is that it can't just be done through the Department for Health. We need a cross-government, cross-departmental approach. Luciana Berger, now Baroness Berger, did a lot of work on this before the new government came in, and we submitted evidence and did a whole look into how a cross-government plan could work, which we haven't seen published yet. We'd really like to see the results of that. But ultimately, you need to be looking at prevention and trying to kind of wire in interventions early in schools, through employment. And it's a bit like with physical health, you have, yes, the NHS is there, but also you have PE lessons in schools and nutrition on menus and things that are designed across the system with your health in mind, and that infrastructure is not really in place for mental health. So that's one thing. We really want there to be a cross-departmental plan. Also, the other thing I mentioned already is the waiting lists side of things is still really bad. And the mental health investment standard, I'm not going to try and get too down this tangent, but does ring fence some money. So some of the money is already there. It just needs the system to be directing that towards targets in mental health waiting lists. I think that would be a really important move that the government could do it without committing much additional resource.
Thank you.
If I could add to that, if that's okay, just to say that it's not just the mental health system, there's also the social care system. In the mental health system, it's very much focused on recovery, which is one thing, but there are people who have or may always have those ongoing support needs. And unless you're able to access that through the social care system, you won't get that unless you've got PIP to pay for it yourself. The mental health system doesn't provide that form of support.
Thank you. Really helpful. Thank you so much. Steve Darling.
Peter will lead first, then I'll follow up.
Okay, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the Green Paper specifically, I wondered what your views were in terms of it increasing or hindering the chances of finding employment.
You can't cut people's support and then think that that's just going to lead to people going into work. It's just fundamentally not how it works. We're going to have more and more people feeling at risk, not getting the kind of support that we need. And when we're thinking about PIP in particular, that isn't contingent on work. It's meant to address the additional costs that you have as a disabled person that result not from some sort of, act of God, but from the way we've built society, right? Those additional costs almost always accumulate across the way decision makers in the House of Parliament have over years and years excluded us, right? And none of that has changed as a result of cutting our support as proposed in the Green Paper. It's going to make it potentially harder for people to find work, to have the solid base that you might need to feel like you can push on. And I wanted to pick up the right to try, because in essence, yes, that is a positive, a very small positive change, but the way it's being proposed and to be implemented is still not anywhere near what you would need. The right to try, as written out in the Green Paper, just says you're not going to be reassessed immediately when you report that you are trying work. What you'd actually need to have there is the guarantee that if you find work and it doesn't work out, that you can return to the social security system where you were without risk. You're still putting risk in for work there. You're still saying to people, if it doesn't work out, you will be reassessed and you may lose out. There is still that element of risk that prevents a lot of people, especially as we've already touched on, with the world of work being very hard for disabled people. You're still having that barrier there where people are going to be worried that it's not going to work out, and what does that mean?
I think specifically on the additional £1 billion investment in employment support, with the cuts to income support for disabled people, how do you see those two? They seem contradictory.
Yeah.
What's your
Can I
views
pick
on
this
that?
one up, Mikey?
Of course you can, yeah.
I think it's frustrating because it's snakes and ladders. There's things that help and things that then bring you back to where you were before, and that's difficult. As you say, there's some contradictions there. I think there was some good thinking done behind the scenes in DWP about what some of the issues are underlying economic inactivity, and investing in employment support is the right thing, the right to try is the right thing, even though, of course, as Mikey rightly points out, they need to work out eliminating risk from that. But then Treasury come along and say we need $5 billion of a cut, and then that ends up undoing all the good work. If you imagine a spectrum where, like, on the far left is someone who's a long way from work, on the far right is someone who's close to work, you have some measures that chip away at it and are moving people slightly in the right direction. But anything that's going to increase poverty by hundreds of thousands, as their own government assessment says it will, is like a gale force wind in the other direction. So it's quite frustrating, because it's not that there wasn't good thinking, it's that it kind of clashed with short-term incentives about trying to cut money, which has kind of undone a lot of that good thinking. It's kind of how we see it.
100% agree with that. And first, it's impossible to know whether the measures in the Green Paper will lead to any people moving into work, because it hasn't been scored or assessed by the OBR. Now, the thing DWP could probably do is publish its own assessment of its own measures on getting people into work. That would be quite helpful, I think, for MPs who are expected to vote on some of these measures in a couple of weeks' time. And Jonathan's right, like, huge potential investment in employment support for disabled people, completely undone by moving millions of people, I think financially worse off, many hundreds of thousands into poverty, many not being able to receive benefits at all, benefits which might actually support them find a job in the first place. So, I think the increased investment in employment support could be positive, yet to see how many disabled people that would actually support find work. Sadly, completely offset by the sledgehammer that is £5 to £7 billion worth of cuts coming.
And just on the employment point, given the link between universal credit, health entitlement, and the daily living component of HIP, how might this, in your view, affect people with fluctuating conditions, mental health concerns, in terms of those accessing benefits and actually engaging with employment?
Well, I think it's going to be made much trickier. It's already a complicated system now. I think we've got a set of measures that are being put on top of a complicated system, which is going to make it even worse for many people. The Green Paper also talks about some short-term unemployment insurance as well, which I'm sure the committee have looked at. I think that really sort of fails to acknowledge that actually many conditions are long-term. And it feels, I think, to us and to many people that we've spoken to, a real disconnect between people's lived experience of trying to find work, of navigating a complex system that distrusts them, and the measures that are there that are supposed to support them in the first place.
And I'd like to add that there are also a number of different elements within the system and the way it works in terms of engagement with universal credit that act against us being able to move into work as well. And it would have been a really good starting point to be able to work on those with the DWP before having cuts, and also before employment support is put in place. So just there are many examples of these, but just for example with council tax. So every time you earn, if you have fluctuating earnings, every time you earn above a certain threshold, you lose your council tax support, but you don't get it back automatically when your earnings then drop again. So you're in a continuous cycle if you want to try work, and you can't have it's not salaried employment on a stable amount every month. You're then having to continuously reapply for council tax support. Another example is how the system with the DWP at the moment doesn't allow for fluctuating capacity. So you either have to be, someone comes and visits you and assesses your capacity and decides that someone else will be the third party, or you have to do it yourself and realise that there will be times when perhaps you don't, with my own case, you don't have the mental space to be able to report your income and expenses in an accurate way. It's very disempowering to have to be labelled as not having capacity. That's something that could be sorted out. And of course we've got the situation with access to work. My fear is that the money that is going to be invested in employment support is going to be wasted, because actually there are too many problems within the system that aren't addressed in the Green Paper, and because of the other issues with long-term conditions and the real problems for people in terms of not being able to work is not something a work coach is going to be able to fix. There was the survey that was published that said there were 200,000 people who'd be able to work now with the right support and with the right job. But what was also interesting about that survey was the lists of barriers and the reasons why people aren't able to work. And those are not things that are within the remit of a job coach to help you with. So we've already talked about, waiting lists for mental health and social care support. So I do worry how useful that money is going to be unless other things are fixed first.
Thank you. I just really wanted to briefly, because time was against us, pick up on cost shunting, and not just cost shunting within the DWP, but perhaps onto other public services, and perhaps cost shunting onto health particularly. Touched on suicide. I'm also alive to the issues around drugs and alcohol, and whether this might be pushing people more towards leaning on that as a crutch in this really challenging world that we're beginning to enter.
I can take it if that's all right. I think the one that we'd pick up on in particular, and Ellen mentioned it already, and is very important to think about, essentially due to the scale of the crisis in that sector, is social care. PIP is used and benefits is used quite often by local authorities to figure out how much someone can afford, essentially, in terms of personalised support. If you are now going to be assessed as not eligible for PIP anymore, you're suddenly losing lots of social care support. Your local authority is also, on a pragmatic side, trying to figure out how can they raise the revenue they need for social care. And that is a problem that won't emerge overnight, but over 6 months, over a year. And it's not as if our local authorities are flush with cash right now. And so social care will get worse. That leads to further issues for disabled people, loss of independence. We don't have a social care system that is operating particularly well in regards to what disabled people want out of it and what they deserve out of it at the moment. Those things just get significantly worse, I think.
It's really helpful, thank you.
Yeah, nothing more to add. Retweet.
Yeah, if I could just add, the Disability Policy Centre has calculated that I think for every £1 lost in benefits, it's going to push £1.50 onto other services. Agree with everything Mikey said. There's also the issue that if people have their PIP reduced, it's going to mean that the amount that local authorities can charge for social care is going to be reduced. So I do think that there's going to be a huge additional pressure on other services. There are also gaps where services don't exist. So drugs and alcohol, for example, there's no longer in my borough any form of outreach for that at all. And I think that definitely where people are consigned to a life in poverty, there's no hope for people, and when people don't have hope, then they turn to drugs and alcohol. I really worry for our communities and the impact that these cuts will have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna Baxter.
So the government has said it will introduce an additional premium for those with the most severe lifelong conditions who will never have to face a reassessment. Does that alleviate any of the concerns that you have?
I can go because I have a short answer. No. Not to be glib, but we know so little about how this is going to be assessed, how this is going to work, that there's no way we could be confident in it at face value. And the only thing that we've really understood from the last months of discussion is that this group is going to be small. It's going to be a small cohort of people. And if that's the only thing that we know, and that's the only thing that we're being told that we're working off, then no, we can't be confident in it, because we're working at a number in the same way that the Green Paper seems to be establishing a number saved and working backwards. We're doing the same with this premium.
There's no idea how much this element is going to be, like how much it's worth, how people will receive it or qualify for it, and who's going to be eligible. So I agree with Mikey, the answer is no.
One thing to raise on mental illness is some of the language in the Green Paper about this premium was suggesting it would be available to people who only people who will never be able to work and have the most lifelong conditions that will never recover from. Mental illness can be, even severe mental illness, quite fluctuating, and so you know even in a very severe case, somebody who's severe psychosis in their 20s, it wouldn't really be desirable to be saying you'll never ever be able to work again, and so that bar for mental illness is quite impossibly high. Anything that's going to help protect people, of course, is a good thing, not a bad thing. But we would need to see a bit more detail on this and how it's going to work.
And do you have thoughts on eligibility in terms of where you would set that level, or how you would assess people that would qualify for that?
It's incredibly hard. There's a lot of grey areas, and I couldn't kind of design something specific in the here and now. I think one important consideration would be not to make it condition specific, to ensure it's not if you have X condition you qualify, but not Y condition, because conditions you can have things milder or more severe. But I'd need to look at it in the round with kind of everything else, and it would need to be done through consultation with people who use these systems and with people who are experts in mental illness to want to assess that properly.
I think that's right. I think you want assessors who are experts in those conditions as well, rather than the generalists that exist in those roles at the moment.
No, I've got I'm trying to think that.
Okay, thank you. Alan, did you want to add anything, or you're all right? No, thank you.
No, not on that. I think everyone's covered it.
Steve Darling.
Thank you. So, government are planning to restrict access to the daily living component of PIP, and then do a review of PIP. What benefits would there have been of doing the review before restricting access?
I think you probably answered your own question.
I know. I just
it feels very counterproductive to commit to cut personal independent payments to meet an arbitrary financial target and then do a review of the benefit in the first place. I think we'd far rather see the review happen first to really understand what changes can be made and should be made, rather than a big arbitrary cut which is going to be voted on in a couple of weeks' time.
What this speaks to as well is that the government hasn't shown it's working, and so it's very hard for us to work out the logic behind some of the changes to the PIP criteria. So there's a lot of emphasis in the new system on the importance of scoring 4 points on at least one category. What that means is that you could have person A who gets 14 points on a PIP assessment but doesn't get any benefit because they've got 7 twos, or person B who gets 8 points but they do get a benefit because they've got a 4 and 2 twos. And trying to work this out and thinking, again, they haven't shown it working. I'm not quite sure why that works. And for mental illness in particular, when you look at the difference between 4s and 2s, you're hoping you're going to see something that's fairly stark, but it's incredibly arbitrary. And for mental illness, often you get 2 points if you require prompting to do something, or 4 points if you require assistance. If you imagine somebody who's got like a severe eating disorder, you need someone with you to make sure when you're cooking to make sure you're eating, etc. Not counting calories, not panicking, not everything else. You need that. It's probably going to count as prompting, because in most cases, prompting is sort of the mental illness version of assistance. It's like mental assistance. So they've drawn these lines and made that distinction incredibly important between 2s and 4s, but they haven't explained why. And so I think a consultation would have helped a lot of my own confusion, and hopefully some of yours as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt way of summarising where we're at. I think the fact that it's taken an FOI, right, by benefits and work, just to understand the scale of the cuts, right? So around 1.1 million people are going to lose access to daily living. That took an FOI. That didn't, wasn't something the DWP were willing to share. That speaks to a process of reaching an arbitrary fiscal figure and working backwards. And from our perspective, like, the whole process has been pretty, for want of a better word, like shambolic, right? Like, we took ages and ages to get the different formats that disabled people need to engage with the paper. Yeah. And to be honest, those additional formats are just for the green paper and the consultation itself. It's got nothing to do with the additional evidence pack that realistically you need as an individual to be able to assess what the green paper is asking you. Yeah, the PIP review, of course, should have come first, and we'd have loved to have been, talking about that instead today and talking about how we can make that better. But no, we're now going to look at how can we make something that's probably significantly worse, maybe better in the future.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about impacts, there's the number that has been reached as to how many people will end up with an actual loss of PIP. But in terms of impact, and in particular the additional pressures on other services such as mental health services, we have to look at the fact that lots of people are going to be at risk, many more than those who may end up with a loss. And there will be, if you take the 1.325 figure, I think it is, of existing claimants who don't get 4 in any area, and yet according to the OBRs, in their words, highly uncertain judgment, it'll only be 800,000 who end up losing it. That's hundreds of thousands of people who are going to go through the appeals and mandatory reconsideration processes, which we've already explained create trauma, not just for us, but also, our friends and families and everyone who goes through losing that income and then having to fight for it to come back. And also people who may end up absolutely fine, people who do currently get 4 points. We're still going to be very scared because the points awarded at assessment is done in such an arbitrary manner, so nobody is going to feel safe at all, and that means much wider impact than just talking about those people who are actually going to lose it. And as people have said, there's just huge amounts of information which is missing, and this isn't something that MPs should be voting on when they don't have that information.
So to put a positive spin on the world that we're in at the moment, in bearing in mind that the clock is ticking, if you had some key principles or culture to apply to PIP to change it for the better, what would those key principles or culture that you would want to see reflected in a reformed PIP system?
I could say 4 things very quickly. I think one, we've heard a lot about mistrust, so there has to be a principle around trust and belief in claimants. I think we need to see more accurate and less burdensome PIP assessments in the first place. We know lots go to tribunal, lots are overturned, lots are found in the claimant's favour. The third thing I mentioned in the previous question is having appropriate expert assessors in specific conditions. And then finally, I think we talked a little while ago about the extra cost of disability and PIP not meeting those extra costs. We think there's something in an enhanced PIP rate that supports people to cover the essentials.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the only thing we'd add there is that improving PIP would be also for it to establish itself not as a distinct thing separate from our health and social care system or from our housing system, right? it's social, societal infrastructure, our benefit system, that has to fit into those other departments too. Part of the reason these cuts are so drastic and are going to have these knock-on effects is because we're treating them as if you cut $5 billion from the DWP, that doesn't affect anyone else and do anything else anywhere.
Any other reflections, please?
I'd just add to that stability. There are 1 in 6 PIP claimants are in work, and we rely on the income from PIP to be able to remain in work. But where you've got constant fear of reassessments and the reassessment process, then that moves us further from being able to stay in work. And in terms of people's health and well-being and pressures on mental health and the NHS, fewer reassessments would be very helpful.
Thank you. I was speaking to somebody only the other day who was describing PIP as a safety net around the broken access to work system. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to go to Frank McNally.
Everyone, can I ask you specifically around the plans to restrict access for UC health element? The Green Paper highlights the LCWRA claimants from 16 to 24 is around 150,000 young people. So can I ask you your views on this element of the proposal and whether you think the actions aimed at supporting more young people through Right to Try, we've touched on earlier on the youth guarantee and additional investment in employment support will be effective in supporting disabled young people into work?
I mean, it's such a small number of people under 22. You know, I think delaying access to the health element of UC for people under 22 will have disastrous consequences. It risks increased poverty, loss of independence and barriers to employment. It's not clear whether all disabled claimants under 22 on UC will have to look for work or what employment support will be available to them. I think like many of the measures put forward in the paper, a lot of the impact and detail is not there and it's unclear, and we're sort of clutching at straws as to what the intent is on some of these things. I think we'd be really concerned if the minimum age for health element was raised to 22.
Things like Right to Try are great, but they're only relevant if you're able to work. So what happens if you're under 22 and you can't work? And from a mental illness perspective, adolescence is by far and away the most likely time for you to experience severe mental illness. I've lost count the number of people through this job who I've met who went to university and then were hit really hard by psychosis and schizophrenia, and then your early 20s become almost unsalvageable at that point. A really difficult time. Of course, it's concerning there are more young people out of work and more young people who are ill, but I think we should be addressing the causes of that. It's like if there was a worrying rise in youth asthma, we wouldn't restrict access to inhalers. We would look at how to kind of help address the underlying problems. And I think it sounds absurd when we put it in physical health terms, but with things that people link to mental illness, that kind of strange logic still seems to apply, that if you just take things away from people, they'll realise they weren't really ill and go back to work. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, it feels to us like tantamount to saying to people under 22, like your disability, your impairment, your long-term health condition, that's not as real as it will be when you're 22. It's completely arbitrary. And for a lot of young disabled people, you are right, James, to say it's a small cohort, but like it's a small cohort, but still a lot of people, right? It's tens of thousands of young people that you are saying, as if this goes through, your experience is not real, it's not valid, and don't worry, it's fine because your peers are going off to work, maybe to further education, but you can't because of an arbitrary decision we've made. It's really dangerous, and it sort of fails to acknowledge all the reasons that young disabled people end up in a scenario where they might not be going on to further education or to work. Not that those places are particularly great for young disabled people at the moment. You know, it doesn't address the failing SEND system, for instance, that has the outcomes that it does. All it is saying to young disabled people, good luck, essentially.
Just to build on what others have said, if young people receive adequate therapy, intervention, support, then that can set them up for better life outcomes. But if their experiences are very negative, and Mikey spoke to the way it could make people feel whose support needs aren't being met, and also the material deprivation they may experience as a result, then negative experiences are going to lead to longer term negative life outcomes, which then require intervention and support throughout people's lives. Getting those early years right are really important.
Thank you very much for those answers. I suppose just building on that point that Ellen has made there, if you were engaging with the government on how we can support young disabled people into work who want to work and are able to work, and these proposals would, clearly there is opposition to from the panel today. What would that look like? What would you look to establish to support more young disabled people into work?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is that removing benefits does not lead to more people getting a job. The previous government consulted on change to the work capability assessment. The OBR found that removing £5,000 from people, from 400,000 people, would only lead to 11,000 of them getting a job. So this bizarre sort of thinking that, as Jonathan, I think, really well articulated, that removing money from people suddenly helps them find work is just nonsense, really. What we'd want to see is that financial support to remain and investment in the SEND system, as Mikey talked about very early on, investment in apprenticeships, investment in the specific schemes for disabled people. I think working with employers, working with disabled people who are leaders in industry who can come and speak to young disabled people, because there are very few role models. This is, this goes beyond the welfare system, but this thinking that just removing this benefit or making it far harder to get is going to lead to the outcome that we want you to have is nonsense.
I think there's a couple of things. There's dealing with the underlying problems of why we have high illness, mental illness, which is my remit, but also other kinds of illness, which is what I talked about earlier about kind of a prevention agenda and waiting lists, etc., etc. There's kind of no quick fix there, but those things need to be looked at. In terms of helping people who are able to do some work, and we know most people who have mental illness or are out of work do want to be in work, I think the government's doing some of the right things in terms of investing in employment support. So our charity, we run IPS and IPS Plus services, and we run a service called Into Work, which works with employers and people who are out of work and tries to bridge some of those gaps. I think, as I said before, what's a bit frustrating is that I feel like the government is doing some of the right stuff and the wrong stuff at the same time. It's just cancelling out. And that might be to do with different incentives in different parts of the government. I can't speculate, but I think there are people in the system who know what the right things to do are. I think, as I mentioned earlier, Luciana Burge has done a lot of great work on this. There's officials in DWP have done a lot of great work on this. It's just, if the answer is how do we make this work but also take $6 billion out of people's support, then that doesn't work. It's not going to help.
No, nothing to add from me.
Okay, final question, just moving to I suppose another group of impacted disabled people who might find it challenging to access work would be older disabled people who have been out of work for a long period of time. We know the challenges for that cohort to actually get back into work. Perhaps there's an erosion of skills that have accrued over many years. What's your views on the support that's required with that particular cohort?
Well, we've heard a bit about reasonable adjustments and the very few employers who are willing to be reasonable and make them. We know that many disabilities are acquired in life rather than being born with them. And as you get older, more people acquire disability. I think what we're seeing is employers not willing to make those adjustments. We're seeing employers not willing to have the flexibility to support people with a fluctuating condition. And there are some things where, I think DWP across government could be making some positive noises and introducing measures particularly around flexible working, particularly around sick pay, and particularly I think just around recognition amongst employers of what disability is. This is one of the biggest barriers. You know, everything we've talked about is quite structural, but it all leads back to attitudinal issues towards disability and disabled people. That's particularly acute when you're older.
And just to say on attitudes and how we're perceived as disabled people, quite a lot of that bleeds out from the benefit system and process itself that assesses you in that way, that says to most people, you're not as disabled as you say you are, or you are not deserving of state support in the way that you feel you might be. That attitudinal stuff bleeds out from the DWP system. For a lot of people, it's very difficult not to internalise that, especially if you're older and have been through quite a few processes here of doing this for years. In terms of making the world of work better, access to work is not a perfect system or a particularly expansive one, but there are a lot of tangible improvements that we can made around that would make working easier for older disabled people. But one thing also just to remember, especially around the older cohort, is quite a lot of those people have been made unwell by work, right? A lot of the people who come up in that cohort is musculoskeletal as a result of working. So there has to be that consideration as well of like, how are we through things like the Employment Rights Bill, making work safer for people, because you're going to just perpetuate this out and do it again.
Thank you. I think Danny Kruger wants to have a quick question.
Very quick question. Thank you. Maybe to Mikey, speaking across the spectrum of disability, just to understand what it is that you think in terms of the review of the PIP assessment that's going on. Do I understand you to be suggesting that the problem is actually the whole capability assessment itself, the idea that we should be judging people on their functional abilities or disabilities? And are you suggesting it would be better to have a system that's simply based on diagnosis, that rather than a kind of potentially quite an intrusive assessment of people's functional abilities and disabilities? How should we do it better, I guess, was what I'm asking you.
Doing it better, I would stay clear personally of saying that a diagnosis is the only way in which you can formalise your experience of disability. I think in the first session when you heard from Ben, can't remember which university, so sorry to his university, but Ben, he talked about how we are pushing people to medicalise their experiences because that is the only way in which you can access support. In theory, the two assessments, not that they could be made to work and they're great, but they are assessing two separate things. Work capability assessment, as the name stands, is assessing your ability to engage with work, and PIP is assessing your extra costs. Those two experiences are very, very different. In terms of what we would want to have, we would want to have disabled people co-producing the assessment process appropriately and not doing the thing that happens a lot in government of asking disabled people, how can we make these cuts better? Right, you can't really I can't remember who it was. It might have been Rick Burgess from Greater Manchester. On my first day at DRUK, I met him and he said, you can't co-produce austerity, right? You can't co-produce cuts because you're asking disabled people to be put in a position where how do you do that, right? In terms of assessment, the problem is that from top to bottom in both of these systems, your assessor is really trying to find a way not to give you support. That's the pressure that they feel either formally or informally. And something that we did in our research at Durham is we spoke off the record to quite a few assessors to understand what it's actually like. And a lot of them told us either that they felt a bit like, not even a neutral arbiter, but like they knew more about disability than the assessor, the claimant did, or that because they had someone above them, that decision maker that the DWP talk about, this human backstop, that they could be harsher. Because it was like, I can be strict here because someone above me, if I get it wrong, they'll just say, they'll make the decision, it's not me. That's a fundamentally flawed process on both of these because it's not asking disabled people, how are you experiencing disability, impairment, long-term health condition as it regards work or as it regards your additional costs? What you're asking is how can you put yourself in these boxes that we can assess really formally.
That's helpful, thank you.
Could I quickly just add to that? Just that I think the assessment process needs to factor in the real world of work and the realities of someone with their particular support needs and access needs being able to find a job. The reason why we have the extra component is because the standard rate, although it's great it's been raised, is not enough to live on. It leaves you at destitution levels. So if you don't have any long-term prospects of a job, you're not able to survive on that amount and therefore need the additional component. But it may be that functionally, or even according to diagnosis, a person could work, but in the real world they can't, and therefore they do need that extra component.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been a really informative panel. We've concluded our questions now. We're going to take a short break. Order. Order, and a very warm welcome back to the Pathways to Work inquiry, and we welcome our second panel for today, and this includes David Finch, who guested last week as well, so nice to see you again, David. Ben Barr, and in the interest of transparency, I should mention that Ben and I used to work in the same department together. Dr. Lucy Foulkes, and we also have David Berry from Manchester. Would you like to introduce the departments that you and the organisations that you represent, starting with you, David?
Yeah, I'm David Berry. I'm Work and Skills Lead at Manchester City Council, experienced in commissioning and designing and delivering employability programmes.
I'm David Finch, Assistant Director in the Healthy Lives team at the Health Foundation.
I'm Ben Barr, I'm a Professor in Public Health at the University of Liverpool.
I'm Lucy Foulkes, I'm a Research Fellow in the Department of Experimental Psychology at University of Oxford.
Thank you, and as I say, a warm welcome to you all. So we've all got some questions for you, and I'm going to kick off if that's okay. And I wondered if you could describe what we know about the health status of working age people at the moment, and what is driving that. Who would like to start?
I mean, I can talk about mental health only, so I don't know if you've got some broader points about health.
So I did the broader, and then you
yes.
What we've been finding is that the working age, the health of the working age population is getting worse on various measures over the last decade or so. So predating the pandemic. It's one of the measures that's particularly relevant for some of this discussion is the one on people with work-limiting health conditions. That's been increasing, as well as people just reporting that they do have a long-term health condition. That data tends to be from some of that data from the labour force survey, but we also see that type of similar patterns across multiple surveys, and also we see some of that within kind of diagnosis data as well that we can derive from GPs and kind of prescription data, and particularly mental health conditions have been rising quickly, and particularly for younger people. So I won't go into too much detail, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. And although there have been some questions about
I think it was picked up slightly in the last session about why that mental health has been worsening, and whether it is actual worsening of mental health. You do see reflected in things like mortality rates, that they're higher now than they were in the sort of 4 years before the pandemic. Some analysis in recent work we funded with the IFS showed that, and it's particularly due to deaths of despair, which are linked back to kind of mental health conditions. So I think there's a kind of fairly broad amount of evidence to show that has been, that kind of health in general has been worsening. And I think it's also, although a lot of the discussion tends to be about people who are out of work, it is increasing for people in work as well. So you've got broadly about the same number of people in work with a work-limiting health condition now as you have people who are out of work. And I think for us the real concern is if we're thinking about, I suppose, employment and people's health then deteriorating once they leave work, is really focusing on people who are in work and their health as much as worrying about people who are already out of work and their health conditions.
Thank you. Do you want to carry on, Ben?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognise how bad trends in public health have been for the last decade. From around 2012, basically improvements in life expectancy stalled, and we've seen virtually no improvements since then. And of course, that was exacerbated by the pandemic. But importantly, those trends in life expectancy have not been equal across the country, and we've seen a massive widening of inequalities. So, in 2023, the life expectancy is still like 3 years below what it would have been if the pre-2012 trends had continued, and we've seen this widening gap in life expectancy and mortality between kind of richer and poorer areas. And the reasons behind that, there are multiple reasons, I think, but one of the sort of key factors has been the cuts in public services and in part welfare reforms that have happened during that time. We've published evidence showing how cuts to local government led to declines in life expectancy, and that we see that particularly across the sort of deaths of despair that we've already heard about, and increases in suicides, but also reduction in improvements in cardiovascular disease, particularly linked to increases in diabetes and obesity. And as we've already heard, we also see during that time this deterioration in mental health, but importantly, that deterioration has happened together with widening inequalities. And that doesn't seem to be fully explained by sort of increases in ascertainment, as people say, because even when we look at survey data and the kind of mental health symptoms that people are reporting, we see that those have increased and those gaps have widened. In particular, that the increase in inequalities is particularly relevant for the issues that this committee is looking at, because that basically means that poor health is becoming increasingly concentrated in places where there are weaker labour markets, fewer good jobs, much more sort of financial stress and increasing levels of poverty. So as we get that concentration of poor health in places with other multiple disadvantage, that particularly drives this increase in people needing support through the disability benefit systems.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panel would like to?
I just agree in focusing specifically on mental health, and my area of expertise is focused most in adolescents, so 10 to 24-year-olds, but their mental health relative to previous generations is worse just about every way you measure it. So whether you get self-report data in from cohort surveys, or whether you ask their parents in cohort surveys, or you ask how many people are going to the GP, or how many GPs are recording a diagnosis for them, on all those metrics things are getting worse, almost kind of year on year for the past 10 or 15 years. What is relevant is that most of the time the way we measure mental health is by asking people to report on their own mental health. So I think that's relevant for understanding why it's increasing. And I can talk more about that. But there are lots of legitimate reasons why the problem itself is getting worse, but also there's the possibility that there's changes in reporting, and those two are kind of pitted against each other as though you've got to pick one, but I think it's probably a bit of both happening.
Okay, I know Dr. Becky Cooper wants to come in here as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the data and what you're seeing about people who are in work and people who are out of work. So, and I know, Professor Barr, you've talked about inequalities and the disparities sort of perhaps geographically, but people who are in work across the mental and physical health spectrum, do they generally display better levels of physical and mental health compared to people out of work? Because the premise of the Green Paper is all about sort of putting down the barriers that might sort of come up against people who are trying to get into work. And if there are disparities there, could you explain them? And also people in work, are there different types of work? We talk about good work. So perhaps you might tell us about what that is and how we sort of perhaps can try and encourage that good work and what demonstrable benefits that has for health. That's probably quite a lot, so let me know how you pick it. I don't know if David, do you want to go first? Yeah.
I think one of the things we've got to look at is it's about helping people to manage conditions. So good quality employment support, good work being good for health can help people to manage the conditions that they have. You know, it's very rare that like an employment support service would be able to support somebody to become healthier to a condition where they're not having to manage that condition. So that's one of the key things that we're looking at. And the prevention approach obviously means that people can not develop co-issues such as like mental health conditions if they're experiencing something like a musculoskeletal condition at the start. And that's why we're trying to intervene early to prevent those issues from becoming worse. I think that perhaps the start of the conversation is very much around prevention, and if you're catching people at a later point and supporting them then it's really about helping them to manage their condition and find work if it's accessible to them that will help them, you know, in very much a person-led way to support them with that condition.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a really good question about whether the people's health is better in work or not. I mean, I think and it's partly the surveys we have access to that tell us about this. You have kind of work limiting or not condition, and then a type of condition underneath it. You don't really get severity. I suppose what we would think is that if someone is reporting a similar condition but is unable to work, then it would suggest that the people kind of out of work have a more severe condition, I think. But where that, I think, is probably not always going to be true is about kind of labour market opportunities as well. So I think some work, other work we funded as well with the Learning and Work Institute kind of points towards it's about the types of work that are available in different areas that people can do, which would play a different role. So, and I think also then the duration that people may have been out of work will compound some of the health conditions. So it's not purely about the health condition, and you know these things will change over time and potentially will be worse. But people may have started from a very similar position, but then had a different kind of paths from that point. I think on the quality of work, I mean, there's good evidence to show that people's health can actually be made worse if the work is wrong than if they remain unemployed if it's poor quality work. So the quality of the work is really important. I suppose a lot of discussions will tend to focus around kind of insecurity, kind of zero-hour contracts, that type of employment. But I think it's also important that people have control within their work. It's also another kind of key element, so that kind of autonomy and control in the work that people do. So that doesn't mean that you can't have effectively lower paid work that provides some of those things as well as stability and kind of structure in the day-to-day life. So it's not purely about, I think, everyone getting very high paid jobs. It's making sure that the jobs that are available provide the kind of appropriate levels of I think structure and stability and security for people when they're moving into work. And I think one thing, a final thing that we have tended to notice is particularly some of the areas where you're getting, I suppose, more pressure on people's health for people who are in work at the moment have tended to be in some public service areas, so places like education, the healthcare sector, where I think where the data would suggest people are increasingly under strain. And I imagine from the resources available that is playing out in people reporting kind of worse mental health rather than, I think, on the physical health side.
Thank you, that's so useful. I don't know, Ben or Lucy, but
I'm just briefly going to add the importance of not just looking at averages and saying, yeah, that this idea of good works is just, I just don't think it's meaningful to say whether work is good or bad. Same with education, like on average it's probably better to be in school, but there are some young people that school is incredibly stressful and the source of their problems. So I think it's great to hear that, yeah, the idea that you're distinguishing, there might be characteristics that you can predict which dictate whether a job is good or not. And I suppose that varies massively depending on the nature of the job and the nature of the disability and all sorts of factors.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the relationship between employment and health is really complex, and obviously you've got people's health affecting their employment and their employment affecting their health in both directions, some work being good for people's health and other work potentially damaging. I think the only thing that I've really add is that, you know, to support people into work with health problems does require good employment support, but it also, the geographical pattern of people being out of work for their health is, you know, is very clustered in particular places. It also requires developing kind of economic growth in those places that's actually going to be inclusive of those people and develop jobs in those places that's going to help people with health problems move into those jobs. And you know, there is a lot of emphasis on sort of economic growth, and we've done some work with Preston where they've had a kind of inclusive economic strategy and found they had a big effect on employment, but their effect on employment of people with disabilities was 5 times greater than on non-disabled people. So there is a role for inclusive economic growth strategies as part of strategies to try and improve outcomes for disabled people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very quick one to Professor Barr.
So you mentioned in terms of the inequalities in life expectancy and how they are clustered in particular areas. Does that reflect the pattern of healthy life expectancy as well?
Yes, I mean, broadly those two things are kind of connected, obviously, because and in fact the gap in healthy life expectancy is even greater than the gap in life expectancy. So people are not only dying sooner but are developing health problems earlier in the life course, and that's a particular issue where where there's a policy looking at arbitrary age cut-offs, for example, in the proposals, because that will mean that people in more disadvantaged circumstances are going to be more affected by those policies, because they're going to be developing those health conditions earlier in the life course.
Thank you. And now we are going, I'm looking from a list. Frank McNally.
Professor Barr, if I could just stick with you for this question. I'm conscious you have done a great deal of research on some of the areas that we're looking at today and previous changes to welfare. Can I ask your assessment of the impact that previous welfare changes have had on the health of those who are affected?
Yeah, sure. So to understand what these reforms, what impact they might have, we can look back at what we found in previous reforms. And we've looked at a couple of other sort of similar policies. The first one was between 2010 and 2013, with the introduction of the work capability assessment, and the government implemented a programme of reassessing the eligibility of people that were previously on incapacity benefit and using the work capability assessment, and if they were found for fit for work through that process, they were moved off employment support allowance. So that was a very large policy. Over 1 million people put through that reassessment process over a relatively short period of time. But it was rolled out in a sort of staggered fashion across the country, And we used that to then look at what effect that had on mental health, but also on employment. And you could see quite clearly that as people were put through that reassessment process in an area, that led to an increase in suicides, mental health problems, and increased prescribing in antidepressants. And that wasn't explained by any other sort of changes in those areas that we looked at. So we estimated that policy in itself led to about an additional 600 suicides, 300,000 additional cases of mental health problems, and the prescribing of about 700,000 additional antidepressants. We were also able then to look at the effects on employment. There's been a lot of people talking about the potential how these changes can increase incentives for work and improve employment prospects. But we found that that policy wasn't associated with any increase in people with disabilities moving into employment. What we did find is that there was some shift of people within the kind of labour force survey moving from saying that they were out of work because of their health to saying that they were unemployed and looking for work, but no actual movement of people into employment. And that was also supported by the assessment from the OBR that policy didn't release the fiscal savings that was hoped, and largely shifted people from disability benefits onto unemployment benefits, and then those people, many people potentially then recircle back into claiming disability benefits. We've also just completed a study looking at the 2017 change in employment support allowance, where the rate for the work-related activity group was reduced by about 28% to make it the same level as job seekers allowance. And that we've used sort of representative survey data to look at comparing people that were affected by that policy before and after the policy compared to a group of people that weren't affected by it. And we also found that seemed to have led to an increased incidence of depression and increasing movements of people into poverty. And also we found that didn't have an impact on employment. We've also reviewed international evidence, systematic reviews, so we collected the international evidence of all similar policies that have been implemented across OECD countries, looking at whether restricting access to disability benefits improved the employment of people with disabilities, and the majority of studies that we looked at in the 17 policies didn't find any effect on employment of restricting access to disability benefits. So there really isn't the evidence there to show that by removing benefits or restricting access to those benefits that you get a benefit in terms of employment.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I suppose just building on it slightly, given the scale of the work that you've clearly carried out and internationally as well, in terms specifically of getting people into work, are there examples of reforms to welfare that have been successful, and as I say, getting people into work but also reducing the benefit bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think as has been mentioned sort of previously from the previous in the previous session, it's a really complicated issue of trying to improve employment of people with disabilities, and it can't be solved just by making changes to the welfare system. I mean, I think there is good evidence for the kinds of employment support approaches that are effective. The key element, and we've done some reviews of international evidence around this, the key components are coordination, bringing together the health sector with the welfare and support, employment support sector and employers. And that, those, at the moment, those services are really fragmented for people who are out of work. There's the integration between health and employment support has never really, that problem has never really been solved very effectively. I think there is some potential with where that is more devolved, that there's more flexibility for sort of bringing that integrated support, and there are some things in Manchester that potentially sort of provide some evidence for that. But I also think it needs to be a cross-government strategy. So you need strategies that address these issues of rising health inequalities, that address the unequal economic growth that we have, as well as focusing on supporting disabled people into work.
Yeah, I think that just build on Ben's points. The word abandoned in the green paper was very apt, and I think like the employment system hasn't had the right chance, the right opportunity to deliver some of the things that we're trying to talk about, some of the change. And I think integration is a key point of that. We often can see the word hard to reach used about people, but it's actually failed to reach. The services aren't designed in a way that will help people and support people back on their journey, but that it can be more costly to do that. But we've got to look at the wider picture. One of the things that we're doing locally in Manchester is we have integrated health services with our local foundation trust to support people with musculoskeletal conditions, to have a conversation with their clinician to move into an employment programme. But it's voluntary and it's person-led. The action plan is person-led, and it's supportive of that individual. They take up that if they want to do that. And what we'd like to see over time is we can encourage more people to take up that conversation. But the key thing I think that's been talked about in previous sessions is taking away that fear of having a conversation with somebody, and also the conversation being at the right time, sequenced in the right way for that particular individual. And that's not looking at a conditionality element or having conditionality as a backstop for further in the path. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben has already answered a question to a certain extent that I was going to put about the green paper impact of employment and health outcomes of people. So if anybody feels they need to add to that, that'd be really helpful. However, I'd also like to throw another question out there to Lucy in respect of the health component of universal credit, where under 22-year-olds are set to not be able to apply for this. With your expertise around the area that you alluded to earlier on, what reflections would you share with the committee of the impact that not being able to qualify for that health component of universal credit would have on that cohort of youngsters?
And what's the logic behind changing it?
I'm not...
Anyone? To just presumably to save money, right?
One imagines so.
Yes. But yeah, I think for whoever was talking in the previous session, I don't think it makes sense developmentally. It's a big period of risk for developing mental health problems. So the majority of people who ever develop a mental illness will have done so by the time they're 24, and it varies depending on the disorder, but so like anxiety disorders develop in childhood generally, but lots of other things develop in adolescence. So you're potentially cutting off support at a time when they are first experiencing mental illness, but it's also obviously an important time for identity development and understanding their their place in the world and their sense of self-worth, and you establish that by looking at how other people are behaving towards you. And so purely from a psychological level, it doesn't make any sense to deprive people of financial support at that age. I suppose the logic might be that if they're living at home, then their parents can pay for them, but that doesn't apply for lots of young people, and it doesn't seem fair. I don't understand the rationale for why.
Yeah. But you talked about the rationale, the rationale and queries around what does this, what impact do you fear that this could have on that cohort of youngsters? What could the outcomes be in your professional view?
So yeah, this would be speculating because I don't know, but I imagine there would be an important impact on a sense of hopelessness, which is, if you don't have the opportunities presented to you at that age to develop independence, then it's going to affect how you view the future and your place in the world and your place in society. So that's the age period at which all those things are developing. So I imagine if you remove the opportunity to help them become independent, because obviously that's what you're doing in an ideal world. You don't necessarily want them to be on benefits forever, but it's possibly about how do you facilitate them to have a meaningful job and develop mastery and autonomy and all those good things about work. So I imagine if you remove that, then you're sending a bad message about how valued they are and what their contribution to society would be. So those things can have an impact on a sense of hopelessness and all sorts of mental health problems would be my prediction.
Thank you.
Dave?
So I'm just going to bring in a point from the initial question. I think unless employment support radically changes in terms of its design, we'll always see the similar types of outcomes. So, we've touched on today around local design is very important because you're making the best use out of the system, and that can bring in local delivery as well. Much of the employment support that is delivered is delivered by larger organisations, multinational or national organisations which do a good job. But there's also a place in there for grassroots organisations which might be able to build up more trusted relationships with individuals. May also have an existing relationship with those individuals to help them come through the system. And I think without having multi-year sustainability around some of that provision, you're always going to see this kind of environment that we're in at the moment, which is chop and change. And many employment support services are paid in arrears, which cuts out a large number of providers because VCSE, FSE organisations cannot operate in an environment where they have to wait a quarter or 6 months before their first payment, and therefore you're taking out a huge part of the system of support for people with health conditions.
Thank you. David Finch about the proposal to introduce new time-limited contribution-based unemployment insurance. Just wonder if you can give us a bit more on that and your views.
Yeah, sure. And I think if I can sort of, I suppose, frame it in a broader sense as well, because I think it's part of what could be potentially a useful and a helpful reform. But I think it's kind of recognising, I think, where the kind of the types of employment support and where we are on employment policy for people with health conditions or disability, and just probably how far away we are from having a kind of cohesive system that really fits together and works well. I don't know, there was a question earlier about effective employment support, but I think often some of those measures are happening within the wider context, and to some extent you can draw a parallel with something like maternal employment, where there has been some big improvements over the last couple of decades, and that has kind of, and a bit longer, and that has kind of linked back, I suppose, to various different changes that are happening. So some of it is about legal entitlements for people to be able to return back to work. Some of it is about more childcare support, and then also some of it is about within the welfare system, particularly finding people at a point at which you may think they're more able to go back to work. So you've used kind of age of youngest child for single parents, and within that then also providing kind of appropriate financial incentives to make it worthwhile to go back to work. And I think often for the group we're talking about, a lot of those things are missing in a cohesive sense. So it's one point to recognise, I think you do need these broader changes to come through. Where the contributory benefit, I think, does fit in is that particularly we think one thing we're particularly concerned about is how if you do have a health condition and your health starts to deteriorate at work and you leave, often you don't get any help for several months, and often by that point it's too late. And if your health condition is bad enough, you go into the part of universal credit where actually you don't get practical support to go back to work. So there was the talk earlier about financial incentives to around the extent to which financial incentives stop people from working, but I think it's that from our perspective it's that actually statutory sick pay is really inadequate. Many people don't get it paid for very long and can move quickly into the benefit system instead. And then at that point, you can be 6 months or so without getting any actual help with your health condition. And the longer you're out of work, the less likely you are to return, particularly if you have a long-term health condition. And that can also kind of have a reinforcing effect on the severity of your health condition. So where the contributory benefit could come in is providing much faster and a higher level of financial support to people. I think for us, it would be more beneficial if it was almost framed as closer to something like the furlough scheme, where you're maintaining a labour market attachment so that people don't feel they've left work, but they're more, and you're effectively trying to keep them close to the labour market. They'd also need to have some quite effective practical support with that as well. And again, I think part of the concern with the extra investment in employment support is it's all framed as people being out of work already, when actually it can be more cost effective if you catch people earlier and they've got the right financial support and also the right practical support. You can kind of keep them closer to the labour market, and it's easier to keep them in work.
Before we move on, can I just ask, based on your evidence before, Ben, from the previous work that you've done, whether you've actually been able to estimate the potential impacts of the changes in eligibility of PIP and of UC health component?
We haven't been able to do that, to quantify that exactly. But what we can see from the previous examples that are given is that, it's very likely, and it's almost guaranteed it will increase poverty in people with disabilities, and that's going to have a negative effect on health outcomes.
Okay. Is it a bigger? I can't remember the size of the cohort that.
So it is. These reforms are bigger than the
2017.
previous. Definitely about 3 times the size of what happened in the 2017 reform. So it is likely that the numbers affected and the impact on health will actually be very large.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, and we're moving on now to David Pinto-Duchinsky.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all for your evidence. It's absolutely fascinating and very important. One of the things you touched on, I'd like to focus a bit on mental health. One of the things you touched on was rising prevalence. How much has the prevalence of mental health conditions actually risen over the past decade?
So the exact number varies massively depending on what you're asking and who you're asking and when exactly you're asking. So I probably can't summarise it in a kind of single percentage, but it has definitely increased year on year. I mean, to be honest, there have been conversations going on for a very long time, even in the early 2000s, about there being an increase in mental health problems. But any survey you look at that's measuring mental health now relative to 3, 5, 10, 15 years ago shows that it's getting worse.
But can we put any kind of magnitude on that? Because
so it depends whether you're talking about like people who are above clinical threshold for a certain disorder, and then it depends which disorder you're talking about. Depends whether you're talking about symptoms. Often when these things are measured kind of in cohort studies, they're actually measuring general distress, which is correlated with having a mental disorder, but not necessarily the same thing. So no, and it depends on the age group that you're asking. So no, I know it's tempting, but I can't pick a number that would fairly represent the whole thing.
Do others have any views on that?
I mean, when we have looked across different surveys, and it's with all the caveats that is probably far more carefully than I might have done used. I mean, it does look like people reporting like mental health conditions, and to some extent it's the surveys that the question sets that are asked that show whether people have psychological distress have roughly doubled since around 2010 within the studies, and that's also within our health record status. That's people diagnosed with anxiety and depression and getting prescriptions.
So roughly
and
double.
much faster than amongst young people.
And how much of that has happened post-2019?
I don't have that one to hand in front.
It also depends on the survey, and also COVID is also very messy because some things increased immediately post-COVID and then went back down again. And yeah, the trouble with relying on, for example, antidepressant prescriptions if they have doubled, for example, so one study between, I think, 2010 and 2018 showed that antidepressant prescriptions have doubled, you can't really conclude anything about whether that means rates of mental health problems have doubled, or whether it's that people are seeking help more readily, or whether the GP is prescribing it more readily, or a bit of all of that. And also you can't really conclude what specific disorder might be changing, because antidepressants are given for lots of different reasons. That was so it's not that I don't understand the question, it's that genuinely there's a hesitancy in putting an exact number on it.
And I totally, and look, one of the reasons I ask, and it'd be really interesting to get into some of the drivers in a second, is because, so let's say, an analysis done by the FT a couple of weeks ago, based on DWP data, shows that, if you look at, say, the cohort of, roughly 20 to 40-year-olds, citing as their mental health conditions as their primary condition for application, the numbers, I don't recall whether it's claiming or whether it's applying for claim for PIP have tripled. And so it's trying to work out, and then this is very much to some of your research, what that's reflecting. And is it a straightforward read across to distress? Is it straightforward read across to underlying mental health conditions? Is it some mixture of awareness, underlying conditions, and other stuff? And I would love your views on that.
Well, it's the question I've been trying to answer for about 6 years, and that I don't think there is a straightforward way of teasing apart those three things. So if, for example, increasing general distress or symptoms of mental health problems, if they are increased now relative to 10 years ago, it's either because things that make people's mental health worse have increased, so I can talk about that's a whole group, I can talk about that's number one, or number two, it's things that are normally protective of mental health have decreased, or number three, it's that reporting has changed, and even within reporting, it could be that the problem was always there, it's just that people are more readily admitting it now, so that will make it look like things are getting worse, but actually that's just because of a decrease in stigma, for example. So maybe rates of depression were always high, it's just that we're telling people now that they're high. And then the second component of the reporting thing is that people are over-reporting things that they don't need to be reporting as mental health problems. And some people have really jumped on that as a reason to dismiss people who are reporting more rates of mental health problems. I can describe the things in the first two buckets as potential reasons why things are getting worse and potential reasons why protective factors are just decreasing. But it's basically that the frustrating thing is that if we see an increase in general distress or mental health problems or people going to their GP or antidepressant prescriptions or whatever, it's very hard to know which of those three things it is. And by far the most likely explanation is that it's a bit of everything.
Interesting. Ben, David, do you have any views on this?
There's just one concern with the specifically that survey data that I think was used in the FT article you're talking about, where they compared the prevalence in surveys to the prevalence within benefit claims. I think we had been funding some work with the IFS to look into can we see from survey data what's driving some of the trends in disability benefit claims. And I think probably the main lesson from that is that the surveys, I think, are just not very good at the moment at picking up the answers. And it's partly there's been a lot of issues with sample sizes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the labour force survey.
Very much so.
You don't get, the survey that was used in that FT article, you don't get a similar trend in disability benefit claims as we're seeing in the administrative data, which makes it quite hard to think that it's validly showing what's happening. You do get a similar trend in the Labour Force Survey and Family Resources Survey, and those are pointing towards mental health on the broad, on fairly broad measures of mental health. But I think it's so, and the discussion we've had before pointing back towards some of the kind of acute bits of things like mortality rates in working age people point towards kind of acute mental health. But I do think kind of all the reasons that Lucy is also saying make it quite hard to understand how far those are genuine worsening and how far we're picking up stuff that was up.
And so drilling into it, so it sounds like, one, it's very difficult to untangle the causal story. That we, as you said, Lucy, I think you put it very well, there are these three different buckets, but it's not completely clear A, how much is in each bucket, and B, how they interact. But insofar as you have seen evidence that underlying mental health is worsening, and it's not clear what proportion of the problem that is, what do you think is driving that?
What's driving it?
Yeah. Well, of as I say, look, I'm going to use the wrong words, genuine mental health worsening as opposed to awareness or...
So, and I'm taking some of my answer from really good work that's happening between the Youth Future Foundation and the University of Manchester at the moment. So they're currently trying to answer that question. So they've come up with a list of theories and they're trying to unpick what evidence exists for each of those theories. But so the list that they have at the moment, everyone's favourite one is social media and smartphones, COVID, worsening economic conditions, change in academic pressure, so the idea that young people are under more pressure to perform in a certain way at school now, change in healthy behaviours, so possibly it's that people are doing less of the things that are good for mental health, like exercise or diet. I think that's the extent of the things that have got worse bucket. Oh, climate change as well. The possibility that there's more anxiety about climate change. But so what the Youth Future Foundation and Manchester are doing at the moment is for each of those, looking at the evidence that exists that the thing is increasing alongside the increase in mental health problems, but also that there's some causal evidence. So it's obviously not enough to just say, like, oh, climate change has increased at the same time that mental health problems have got worse, or smartphone use. You have to then have either longitudinal evidence or randomised control trials or experimental evidence that demonstrates that one thing increasing has some causal relationship on mental health. That is much harder to do. And actually, from what they've done so far, several of those options, their answer is just the data isn't there. So theoretically, it makes sense that maybe academic pressure might have contributed to worsening mental health problems, but there's no hard evidence that has demonstrated that causally. So the best we've got at the moment is that there's a lot of possible contenders. We're probably not ever going to know definitely what the answer is, but it's incredibly unlikely that it's just one thing, and it's certainly unlikely that it's just people over-diagnosing themselves.
Sure. And final question, because I'm conscious now of time, is have we seen these similar patterns in other countries? Because I suppose this is particularly germane for this, because obviously rising claimancy for health-related benefits in UK has been an outlier, has been unusual versus other countries. What have we seen from the kind of underlying mental health evidence?
So you guys can speak better to the welfare and jobs side of it, but there has been this pattern across Western countries that mental health problems are getting worse, and people trying to unpack to what extent is it real versus an artefact of increased awareness or change in reporting. So that is definitely not unique to the UK, but I don't know the detail of what other countries are trying to do in terms of understanding the causal evidence.
As in terms of the international evidence, I think you do see these in surveys and with all the kind of caveats, you see similar trends in mental health in other countries across Europe. I guess the only thing that I would sort of add to that is it's the important thing is not just mental health deteriorating, it's also the kind of distribution of those mental health problems and the widening of inequalities. That does seem to be particularly stark in the UK, particularly potentially more than other countries. For many of those indicators, we see those widening inequalities in mental health, which potentially supports some of the sort of causal pathways more than others, possibly, or it's quite difficult to disentangle those effects. But that clustering of mental health problems in people who have faced other disadvantages and is something that has bigger implications for kind of the rise in disability benefits.
Barry has been trying to come in. Did you make a very brief point, and then next couple of questions are just you?
Absolutely, Matt. Cost of living crisis areas where we've seen people on low discretionary incomes against areas that have seen PIP increases. PIP claimant increases as well. So I think, as has been said, the cost of living crisis is a huge factor underlying.
Thank you. Amanda Hack.
Because we're short on time, I just wanted to focus on a couple of things, if I may. I was involved in a round table just a couple of months ago with people with lived experience of mental health and employers who'd supported individuals to stay in work for those individuals with mental health conditions. I'm really interested to understand, that kind of what work can we do to encourage employers to stick with people who are going through mental health conditions, because there are many more people with mental health conditions in work than there are out, and how do we reflect that? But also the changes in the Green Paper about the right to try, and that that delay in the lag between somebody actually starting work and when their benefits may well not be available to them if it didn't work out. Do you think that might have a positive impact? I'm just really interested to see your views on the in-work element.
I think we've got strong evidence to show that the good employment and the good employment charter, which operates in Greater Manchester, is really positive, and employers who are within there can see that they've got higher retention rates because of the wider support that they're providing. What we've got to understand is that that businesses are mostly micro or small, so that there's many of them. So to work with a high proportion of those and to make change is a really challenging area, and would need a significant national effort as well. I think we've heard this morning about attitudes and culture, and I think that's something that needs to come through. There are many good employers out there, but there are also those that struggle to support their employees with health conditions, and it's that level of support which perhaps isn't quite right as things stand.
I've done just two quick things. One is, I think it's partly about making sure you're setting up roles in the first place and designing jobs that can help suit people appropriately. And then I think the second thing is that kind of ability to respond quite quickly when people's health does start to deteriorate or is affecting absence. I think one thing that's come through in roundtables we've done with employers before is a bit of a fear of them not really knowing what they need to do, which I think speaks entirely to the point that David was making, where I think better understanding of what works and that confidence to actually sort of put those job changes in place is really important.
I think what we've also seen quite regularly, and most recently with some programmes, is employees can be quite often have a fear about speaking to their employer about their condition and what might happen with that. So we've tried to put again in services which are person-led, so we can have that conversation. And it's about equipping the individual to be able to have that conversation, but then also the employer's got to meet that side of things. I think that's where the paper needs to set out clearer in the future how that kind of support mechanism coming for employers so they can do their part as well.
Good to hear the Good Employment Charter mentioned. Started in Oldham 10 years ago, so okay. David Pinto-Duchensky.
Thank you, Chairman. I will be very brief. But David Berry, this is very much for you. So obviously Manchester is one of the pilot areas for the Workwell programme, which is for everyone else, health and employment services established by the previous government. Can you tell us a bit about the services and kind of how successful they were, and if there's any lessons you draw from them?
Yeah, it's early days. The programme launched in December, so it's difficult to talk about successes at evidence base, but it's going very well. We've tried to be innovative with Workwell and do something different. In the Get Britain working papers clearly sets out we need a different approach. We're also just about to become a trailblazer area as well. But essentially we're doing a couple of things. We've working in hospitals with clinicians to identify people who need support and then getting them that support. It's a very simple concept, but we believe we're the first place in the UK to be doing that, and it's going really well. Physios, MSK physios have bought into that concept and are referring in high numbers, and we're getting people supported. The other key part of what one of the things that we're doing locally is we've got GP referrals through a social prescribing approach, which we've used as well. And the final part is we're working with grassroots organisations that can provide culturally appropriate services So one thing the Get Britain Working White Paper and subsequent the Green Paper have failed to really look at is the intersectionality between race, health and unemployment. So we've got specific services that are working with either black or Asian residents, but delivered by culturally appropriate organisations, so we can start to work on some of the elements of trust that need to be built with specific communities, so that they can feel comfortable in accessing support and go on and achieve the outcomes and aspirations that they want to achieve.
Brilliant. And look, I'm really conscious of time, and I'm sorry that this is going to be somewhat truncated, because I'd love to ask more about it. But obviously, you talked about the integration, and key to that is having a very kind of devolved, place-based provision. How closely do you work with not just local service providers but local employers, and how important has that devolution been?
I think devolution is really important, but it's got to be true devolution. So we need multi-year agreements, so that we're not just working on a yearly basis, because that can hinder partnerships sometimes, especially when you're trying to do something which is more innovative.
Brilliant, thank you. Chair, in the interest of time, I'll more questions.
David, do you want, I know you have commented along the way in terms of the changes that the government is introducing around the Green Paper, but I wondered in terms of the personalised health and employment support within it, whether you see that as essential to do before or to do alongside any cuts in social security support to sick and disabled people.
I think we can see from the evidence base that we've had programs, in Greater Manchester have had working well, and that's performed really strongly. It's not made the deep shift in changing outcomes needed.
It's fine, carry on. It's a bit like school, so we just.
I think what we need is we're just about to launch a Trailblazer. That Trailblazer needs to happen quickly, and we need to be looking at innovative services like we're doing. Working in hospitals, we're supporting people who want help now, and we're finding them in the right place. That's the. We're not failing to reach those people, we're reaching them in the right place, and I think that's the change that's got to happen quickly, but it can be hampered by a drive to focus too much on collecting data or getting people to sign documentation, for example, and that's my point I made earlier about services really need to be designed about what's going to work for the individual. So if the point is to try and move them into work and get them engaged in the service, what will do that, and what we're doing at the moment is we're kind of like working with one hand behind our back, because we have to ask people 30, 40 questions before we start. They can explain to us what they need from us, because we're collecting too much information from them. And I think that's one of the fundamental points about this, is that you won't get the change you need unless you really start to redesign services differently around the customer experience, the relational experience, and supporting people.
Okay, and again, I think just very briefly, a reiteration of I think the points that have been said before, but I just want to make absolutely sure, should this happen before or alongside cuts to social security to sick and disabled people at the same time?
I think if you had better employment services before the changes were made, then that would be a much more sensible solution, because then you're supporting people before and through that period.
Okay. Any other final points from the panel?
Just really quickly, I think there is constantly this talk between the cuts to PIP and then also employment, and more people getting into employment, and I think there's not that much overlap in the population, or I don't think there will be that much overlap in the population losing out from PIP and those who are able to go back into work. And so, in a sense, you could have the employment support in place and then try and reduce benefits, but people, to some extent, the PIP is there actually helping people to be able to work in the first place. So I think so I suppose I don't think you can do one and then cut the other. A more sustainable approach is kind of dealing with underlying issues like the health of the working age population.
Lovely. Thank you so much, everyone. And that concludes all our questions for this panel.